Today's topic is a very topical one. We have Brian Turner here, who is our very own research scientist for our Aquatic Invasive Species Unit. So he has a very appropriate shirt on and background. He is currently working a lot on European green crabs because it is obviously a very important topic for our state, our region. He also monitors mussels, he has corralled clams, neutralized nutria, sought snails, and identified insects, and definitely into science communication. So if you happen to see him in real life, please say hi. And but it's great now that we can get an introduction to him and hear about this topic.
All right, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and I'll share this. And I just want to double check that everyone can see my screen.
Looks good.
All right, awesome. Then I'll go ahead and get started. So as mentioned, I'm Brian Turner. I'm the research scientist for the Aquatic Invasive Species Division. We just got upgraded. I don't know what that really entails, but there we go. And so I'm going to be talking to you about the work we're doing with green crabs. Broad overview for today. I'm going to be doing a very quick explanation of what I mean when I say aquatic invasive species, telling you about green crabs, how did they get here, their status in Washington, why do we care, what's being done, and how you can get involved. I will say that this is a modified talk from a talk I gave to the estuarium here in town. And so please feel free at any questions at the end. I'm more than happy to address anything I can. So we'll start off by just saying what exactly I mean when I say aquatic invasive species. So aquatic invasive species, as the name suggests, they're an aquatic organism that's been introduced into an area where they weren't historically present. The main reason I lay this out here is that in Washington, when we use the phrase AIS under law, we're specifically talking about animals. So aquatic plants do not fall under the purview of AIS. Some of the problems that aquatic invasive species may cause are things like outcompeting native species, altering ecosystem function, reducing recreation. They can also have negative impact on human health and pet health through transference of disease, and they can have sort of an impact of what we consider the aesthetics of nature and can reduce tourism and recreation as a result of that. So one example here we've got is nutria. If anyone's never seen one of these things before, they're a little bit like the ROUSs from The Princess Bride. They're giant, essentially giant water rats. They got here as part of fur trade. And they can dig up holes and kind of spread disease and things like that. And so that's one of the reasons why they're considered an aquatic invasive species. In terms of what that actually means here in Washington, we actually have multiple levels of AIS classification. The primary ones that we talk about are prohibited species. We have 3 levels here. First is level 1, which is considered to be the highest risk species, and we respond most rapidly to their presence. Green crabs are a prohibited level 1 species, but the one you probably hear most about are zebra and quagga mussels. They are not yet in Washington as far as we know. There's a lot of monitoring and detection efforts undergoing. But if they were to be detected, this would be a massive issue and we would have to respond very rapidly. Prohibited level 2 means there's a high risk of impacts, but it would be something that focuses on long-term site management. There currently aren't any prohibited level 2 species under Washington law, but the status there is still. Prohibited level 3 means that they have a moderate or high risk, and the response is going to vary a bit. These are still high priority, high concern species, but they're usually more established or maybe less impactful. It's much more kind of on a case-by-case basis determination of what actions need to be taken. So examples are New Zealand mud snails and African clawed frogs. I should note that anything that's prohibited requires a permit to possess or release. So you cannot even have these organisms without permission from WDFW. We do also have regulated species. So regulated is essentially, we expect that people have them and have uses for them, but you require permits to actually release them. So for example, regulated type A organisms are basically anything that's harvested for food and game. Regulated type B are anything that's not been classified as food. but still is used in either the aquarium trade or in live food markets. So things like goldfish are regulated type B. And then regulated type C is basically anything else. So if it's a non-native aquatic species that shows up in the state, it's automatically classified as regulated type C if it's not listed elsewhere. And again, these animals can be possessed, but they can't be released without permission. And so that brings me to WDFW's Aquatic Invasive Species Division. The division's grown a lot since I came on about 2 years ago. Part of that is that we're a division now instead of a unit, but we've really spread out in terms of the number of staff that have come on board and the number of priorities and tasks we're kind of covering. Although our primary focus is on things like the European green crab and quagga zebra mussels, we do deal with any aquatic invasive species. So we deal with crayfish, we deal with frogs and turtles and all sorts of things. We cover a large range of circumstances and issues, all of which relate back to this concept of the aquatic invasive species. All right, so let's get to the heart of the matter today and why you all came. You want to learn about European green crabs. So I'm going to teach you how to identify European green crabs using the 5 points of green crab identification. Number one, they have 5 spines on each side, or 5 points. You can see on the side of their carapace here, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spikes. That is unique for green crabs. You're not going to find other crabs with those 5 spots or 5 spines on the side here in Washington. They're about 4 inches across or less. That's about the maximum size they get to. They're a pretty small crab, all things being equal. And so we're not talking about something in the size range of, say, an adult Dungeness or an adult red rock crab. These are pretty small individuals. They have 3 bumps in between the eyes. So if you actually do a count on green crabs, you'll see 5 spines on one side, 3 bumps in the middle, and then 5 spines on the other side. That 5-3-5 pattern is a really great way to identify green crabs. They also have 2 semi-flat rear legs. It's a characteristic of the type of crabs they are. They're not really good for swimming. It's more like a controlled fall. So if you dump them in the water, they can use it to kind of maneuver. But they're similar in structure for those of swimming crabs. And then lastly, they have one inaccurate name. I know I titled this talk as "The Crabs Are the Color Green," which I was trying to put a hip Taylor Swift reference in, but I did not think I succeeded very well. But the point here being is that the coloration is not a great way to identify them. Sometimes they are kind of a more yellowish or even blue tinted color. They ultimately, over time, become kind of orangish or reddish in color. They darken as there's a longer period between molts. So when they freshly molt, shed their exoskeleton, they are a brighter green, but darken over time. And in fact, there was an interesting study by Young et al. In 2017 where they were looking at green crab coloration. And if you look at this color index here, you might be able to read them, but it says things like fresh papaya are the different colors because these are actually paint swatches they got from Walmart and used it to create this kind of color index for their research. So they have quite a variety of colorations they can actually be. So I'm going to try to do a pop quiz here. I'm pulling up the chat. And so anyone who wants to chime in, tell me which one of these you think is the European green crab based on what we've discussed. Oh, you're all paying very good attention. I see only B's, not a single off one. Yep, that is in fact European green crab. The others, this is the letter A is the hairy helmet crab. This is probably the one we often get reported as the European green crab. Most commonly, they're kind of an odd species. People don't see them very often. And so when you do see them, you're like, oh, this has to be some sort of strange new species. They're also green and about the same size as a green crab. So the mistake is pretty common. Letter C is the hairy shore crab. It's a very abundant crab. They're smaller than green crabs, only maxing out at about 3 inches wide, but you find them in a lot of the same places you might find a green crab. So we often get a lot of reports of them as green crab as well. And then lastly, D is the northern kelp crab. I think the main reason we get reports on this one is when they're smaller, they actually are this kind of olive green color that they get from their consumption of green algae. And so, again, you look for a green crab, you see a crab that is green, you get the idea. We get a lot of reports of green crab that are misidentifications. We love getting those because we want to know people are out there looking, and every inaccurate report still means people are looking, and we're hopefully keeping an eye out for when green crab do show up. All right. So now the question is, how did they get here? Well, as the name suggests, European green crabs are native to Europe. It does go from Iceland and Norway all the way south to West Africa. So they have a pretty wide native range. But they were originally transported to the east coast of the United States in solid ballast. So this was before, you had any of these systems where you could pump water in to adjust the buoyancy of the ship. So literally you would take, rocks and sand and stuff from the shoreline and dump it into barrels, travel across the sea, and then dump those barrels out in the Americas. And so that's the primary thought on how they got here. The first recorded detection of green crabs in North America was by a scientist named Thomas Say in 1817. So we've been aware of the presence of green crab on the continent for over 200 years. Now, green crab haven't been on the West Coast that long, though. The first detection that we've found was in 1989 near San Francisco Bay. It's important to note that the first detection doesn't mean that's when they arrived. It just means that's the first time we saw them. Usually there's a lag between the arrival of a species in a new location and when it's actually detected. There's been a lot of discussion as to how green crabs got over here. Some folks think it's maybe through ballast, so a ship may have taken on larvae, gone down south through the Panama Canal, and come back up. But in recent years, the main sort of culprit that's been pointed out is live bait packing. So if you order bait from the East Coast, they would do things like wrap it up in algae in order to keep it damp and alive as they transport it to you. Then you would unpack the bait, and if you just have all this algae and stuff, most people would just throw it in the bay. And so you could have little green crabs in there and just toss them in the water without ever noticing they were there. From there, the green crabs traveled up north, most likely through currents. Green crabs disperse through currents as larvae, and so they can travel great distances within a region once they're established. And so that's the most likely way they've traveled up north from there. They were first discovered in Washington in 1998 in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor. So they've been here in Washington for over 20 years. To give you kind of a global context, this map's it's maybe a little old, but the sort of native range here is in blue. The places we know that they've established are in red. So green crabs have been established in North America, South America, South Africa, Australia. There's some debate as to whether they're in Japan. It seems much more likely that it's actually a similar species, but they've spread pretty far and wide. In fact, this last year, or actually now in 2022 now, they were detected in Metlakatla Indian community, just in the most southern regions of Alaska. And so they have made it up to Alaska in the last few years. All right, so now I'm going to give you a brief overview of the history of green crabs here in Washington. So as I mentioned, green crab were first discovered in Washington in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor in 1998. Their initial discovery was obviously disconcerting. People were worried, and so it began some early days sort of sampling and monitoring. There was a lot of interest really early on, but as numbers remained low over time and there weren't any like obvious impacts happening right away, there was that sort of concern and fear dropped for quite a while. That did, however, come back on the radar in 2012. In 2012, there was a population discovered in Sook Basin in British Columbia. And so the fact that the green crab were no longer just known to be down in Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay, but now had made it up towards the Puget Sound as well, meant they were spreading. There's the potential for them to be spreading throughout the state. So that sort of reinvigorated concern and increased monitoring efforts. But to be honest, it really wasn't until until about 2018 up till 2021 that we saw the real concern rise. Once they got established up in Lummi Sea Pond in 2019, and the population there started to really boom, people were getting really concerned. And so WDFW was WDFW, along with various tribes in the state, including the Lummi Nation, the Makah Indian tribe, the Shoalwater Bay Indian tribe, all of these groups were really promoting this is a problem. This is something we're concerned about. The numbers are going up. This is something that has to be addressed. And so in 2022, I guess I'm not trying to say if he's still in office or when the transition happens. We'll just state governor. Governor Jay Inslee signed an emergency proclamation ordering the department to take what actions is necessary to affect the eradication or prevent the permanent establishment of European green crabs. And so this began what's the current green crab emergency status. In response to that, WDFW instigated something called an incident command system. So this is a structure that's used fairly often for any sort of emergency. So fire response, earthquake response, things like that. To be fair, you can actually use the incident command system to plan any sort of event. You could use it to do a birthday party if you really wanted, but it's more typically used to respond to an emergency event. What it does is it sets up a really clear chain of command and a really clear sort of communication and scope of responsibility. And it really kind of, that standardization is really helpful to kind of plan things out. And so you can see here lots of different subsections. I'm not going to get into all the details because I know it's a lot of tedious to do this, but I just want to point out that the instant command system hadn't been used previously for something along these lines. The green crab invasion has sort of been treated as a really slow moving emergency. So it's kind of like if you had a fire that took years and years to actually spread and sort of show impacts. It's been really beneficial and really successful in a lot of ways. But again, it was kind of a really novel approach to the utilization of this system. And I am just barreling along here much faster than I had expected. So I see someone posted something about, we'll talk about whiskey in a little bit, but that whiskey is an interesting thing. So we'll get into why do we care? Well, one of the things is that so I should point out that most aquatic invasive species have several characteristics in common. One is that they tend to have a wide tolerance for environmental conditions, so they can tolerate a lot of temperatures and salinities and things like that. They also tend to be omnivorous. It's hard to be an invasive species if you can only eat one specific food that is native to your native range. And so, if that food isn't somewhere else, it's really hard to go somewhere. Also, invasive species tend to have high reproductive rates, not necessarily in the hundreds of thousands, but if you only have one offspring per year per individual or one offspring per year, that's not a very fast rate to colonize a new area. So green crabs are no exception, though, to these rules. They have a really wide tolerance for salinity. They can be in almost fresh water to about 55 parts per thousand salinity. They do best in typical kind of marine salinity, so 35 parts per thousand, but they can really occupy these more brackish areas where larger crabs that may consume them don't like to be. They also have a really high thermal tolerance from 0 to 35 degrees Celsius. Obviously, the extreme cold and extreme heat is not ideal for them, but they can overwinter in cold locations and tolerate a wider range of conditions than a lot of our native crabs can. In particular, they can handle hotter temperatures better than our native crabs. They have a really diverse diet. They'll essentially eat anything they can get their hands on. That includes each other, but cannibalism is fairly uncommon for this species compared to some. But they'll eat crabs, clams, cockles, fish if they can catch them, anything at all. Even algae and eelgrass has been found in their diet. Though to be fair, the eelgrass component, we're not sure if it's a matter of they prey upon it or if it's while they're burrowing for clams, they incidentally consume eelgrass. Green crabs also have lots and lots of babies. This picture you see here of the female with this orange egg mass, that's called a buried crab or a gravid crab. And so each one of those, when they do this, can have around 180,000 eggs per clutch. It varies. Some crabs can have more, some can have less. Depending on environmental conditions, they can actually have more than one clutch per year. Now, it's important to note that most of those larvae will die, but still, 180,000, even if only 1% or of 0.5% survive, that's still a lot of crabs we're talking about. And this picture here is just of one of their larvae. Another reason that we care is that there's a lot of documented impacts of green crab to shellfish, particularly commercial shellfish. So a lot of the collapse of the softshell clam fisheries in New England have been attributed to impacts by green crabs. So they found that harvests back in the 1940s and 1950s were greatly reduced due to green crabs, and that green crabs have been responsible for reduction in the settlement of softshell clams. Essentially, the larvae of these clams will settle, grow into small clams, and the green crab will find them and consume them readily. We've seen similar issues in terms of cockles in the Wadden Sea, similar issues with varendid clams in Tasmania, and we even saw a reduction in the survival of these really small clams called Nutricula tantilla in Bodega Harbor in California. These, like I said, green crabs will eat anything they can and that's smaller than them, and they really like bivalves. I should point out that there's been some initial work looking at green crab predation on shellfish here in Washington, but there's not a lot of information or research at this time. There was a very recent paper put out by Grayson et al. Last year in regards to predation on manila clams, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to really get an assessment of what kind of impacts are happening to shellfish fisheries here. We do also know that green crabs can have significant impact on species that we don't really consider commercially important. As I mentioned earlier, this is the hairy shore crab, and it is a very commonly mistaken for green crab, but it's also very commonly consumed by green crab. In Bodega Harbor in California, they determined there was a reduction not only in the number of shore crab, but in the physical size of shore crab as a response to the presence of green crabs. They basically were eating the biggest ones, and so the population as a whole, the adults were smaller in what we were sampling. Eelgrass also, as I mentioned, they dig up these eelgrass beds as part of their predation for bivalves. It's unclear if they're also eating it on purpose, but it's a potential impact that might be happening as well. So now I'm going to spend a little time on what's being done, what actually is happening here in the state of Washington to try to deal with green crab. I want to mention briefly, though, that the efforts that are being put forth in Washington are the largest I'm aware of that ever happened for green crab management. There's been some very limited green crab management activities in Oregon and Washington. There's substantially more happening in British Columbia. There's been a lot of early detection work in Alaska, and they were prepping up to respond to the detections they've had of green crab. And there's been on and off a lot of management discussions and efforts in places like the East Coast of the United States and Australia and South Africa. But the reality is what we're seeing right now in Washington is by far the most effort and money that's been thrown at dealing with green crab. And so it's important to understand that scope. So as you can imagine, dealing with green crab is not a limited situation. We're not talking about one location in one embayment. We're talking about the entire coastline of Washington is of concern, whether green crabs are present or not. And it's complicated, right? So green crab populations, once they establish, for some reason, they just don't listen to us when we tell them about county lines or jurisdictional boundaries. They're just going to do what they want to do. And so there isn't a lot. We have to understand that any management is going to cross these jurisdictional boundaries. It's also important to note that the density of green crabs really varies a lot in Washington. You'll see in some of the data I'll show you later, but the majority of green crab numbers that are being removed are from Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay, and there are significant populations in other parts of the state, but much of the Salish Sea is uninvaded, or if the populations are there, they're significantly smaller than those coastal populations. So the exact priorities and actions happening vary a lot from location to location. It's also worth pointing out that this is not a WDFW solo activity, right? So WDFW is the lead agency for state lands in this issue, but we're also talking about federal lands, lots of sovereign tribal lands. And so it's a huge conglomeration of participants. And just to kind of give you some context, this is the list of co-managers, tribes, and partners that are currently engaged in activities. It's probably not complete. This is a list I took from the Green Crab Management 6-year management plan that I finished creating last year. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to provide you a copy if you need some light 200 plus page reading. But this is, we have lots of different groups, lots of different governments involved in this. And so it's a huge effort. And I want to make it clear that, WDFW and the invasive species division is putting a lot of effort in, but there's no way we would have gotten done what has been done without the participation and involvement of all of these co-managers, tribes, and partners. So as you can imagine, just trying to think about the state, we need to break things down almost immediately to have any sort of functioning management activity. So the first thing we did was split the state in half as into what we call the Salish Sea branch and the coastal branch. Basically, the the westernmost point here of Washington. Anything south of that is going to be in the coastal branch. Anything inland or to the east, into the east is going to be the Salish Sea branch. Further from there, we split each branch into 7 management areas and have had further subdivisions of that. I'm not going to write you an entire list of coordination areas, sides, and subsites, but just know that we keep breaking down the scope in order to make it more manageable, right? You can't manage the entire state as one unit. You have to find these more distinct subunits to work with. Now, there's a number of activities that are happening throughout the state. One of the most important, they're all important, but one of the most is early detection. So when I say early detection, the goal is to detect green crab presence as early as possible after their arrival. So we often do early detection at locations where green crab have not yet been detected. You can also do it in sub-locations of places where green crab are established, but they might not be quite right there yet. The point is to detect those green crabs as soon as possible, because if you detect them as soon as possible, there's a greater likelihood that management activities might be effective. Because if you're dealing with a small, not yet established population, you have far greater likelihood of actually having an impact on it. So some of the tools that we use for early detection are trapping, so just the deployment of a variety of traps in order to try and collect green crabs. We also do some eDNA assessments. We also do molt searches. So a molt search is essentially you walk along the coastline and you look for the molts, this carapace. You can see right here, this little guy. When I talk about the carapace of the crab, it's the top. And so when they molt, that top is kept intact and you can find pieces of that lying around. Similarly, you can also look for dead crabs or dead parts of crabs, but those molts are a pretty good indicator. And there's also work on larval sampling, so larval toes, light traps, to try and collect the larval stage of green crab when they're present. So again, the primary focus for early detection are where green crab have not yet been detected. So this is by far mostly occurring in the Salish Sea branch. Though again, there are some locations within the coastal branch where this is happening on either a limited scale or certain embayments where they just haven't been found yet. Control is probably what most people think about in terms of management action. The goal is simply to reduce green crab abundance, so go out and remove as many individuals as possible to try and reduce the impacts to native species or ecosystems. It's a pretty straightforward thought process, go out there, grab as many as possible, haul them out, we'll reduce the impacts and hopefully reduce the population as much as possible. Currently, the only real tool we have for control efforts is trapping. Chemical tools are not really on the table right now. Pesticides would be too impactful for other similar native species. There's also the fact that we don't have any sort of effective biocontrol tools. If people want to hear about that, I can talk about that later, but there's just isn't anything that seems like a viable tool for that. So really it just boils down to trapping. This is mostly happening where green crab are already established. So the coast is the primary region where control trapping is happening. But I should say that you can do control trapping anywhere green crab are present, right? So whether it's 10 crabs or 100,000 crabs, you can do control trapping to try to bring those numbers down. The last effort I'm going to talk about very briefly is something called long-term monitoring. As the name suggests, it's monitoring over a long period of time in order to assess the community. It's really helpful for us because it lets us see changes in the community structure, both green crabs and native species over time. If you don't do monitoring, there's not really an effective way to see, is the green crab population going down? Is the native population responding and rebounding? How are things going? And so this long-term monitoring is essential. A lot of the long-term monitoring work that's being done is by Washington Sea Grant's crab team. WDFW also has some long-term monitoring sites that we've established, and there are other co-managers, tribes, and partners that have their own individual long-term monitoring locations. Again, right now, the main tool for this is trapping, but there could be other surveys and other methods that could be done to assess species other than green crabs. One of the main elements of long-term monitoring is it lets us know how other species are doing as well. For example, you can do long-term monitoring before green crabs or ever arrive in a location, and it lets you see how the native populations may be changing after the arrival of green crab. I'm a huge proponent of establishing long-term monitoring programs prior to problems happening so that you can actually see what's going on and have sort of an idea of where you're trying to get back to. So I haven't got an updated map for you, so I apologize for the not 2024 mapping effort, or trapping effort, but I wanted to give you some idea of what the scope of what we're talking about. So this is from 2023. These dots on the Washington map here represent all locations where trapping occurred. If the dot is blue, that means trapping occurred, but no green crabs were collected. If it's in red, that means trapping occurred and green crabs were collected. So to give you some context, throughout the year of 2023, 360,000 green crabs were caught. Traps were checked more than 176,000 times. And so by a trap check, I mean you pull up the trap, you look inside of it, you remove any green crabs, you free any bycatch, and you put it back. And over 150 locations were trapped. So there's been a lot of effort. And I should point that all of these numbers are only higher in 2024. I will hopefully have a new one of these maps designed and sent out for public consumption in the next month or so. In terms of green crab detections, those 14 management areas I showed you earlier, 11 of those have had green crab detected in them. But again, the exact numbers vary wildly. So like in the Columbia River, we've only caught a handful, but we've only had very limited trapping efforts. Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor have had a ton. Some locations in North Puget Sound have had relatively low numbers. I'm not saying that to discount the potential impacts in those locations, but if we're just counting pure numbers of crabs, it's significantly lower in general than the coast, with the exception of the Lummi Sea Pond, which had been historically very abundant. There we go. So just to give some context, this is the removals of green crab from across the state. So we have year up to 2024, and then split by Salish Sea, Pacific Coast, and total. I should say that for 2024, we're still doing some QA/QC of the data, but they're pretty good numbers. So overall, we've caught more crab this year than in any other year previous, and in fact, more than all the years combined. There is a particular reason we think that happened that I'll explain in a moment, but I just want to highlight the vast amount of effort and the vast amount of crabs being removed from the state over time. Although you can see the Salish Sea numbers have actually declined quite a bit. Again, this is primarily driven to the successful management actions we've been seeing in the Lummi Sea Pond, which is a unique enclosed area. And so, well, not fully enclosed, but far more enclosed than a lot of our embayments. And so it's been a lot of work, but a lot of success is coming out of that location. All right, so I wanted to give you a little bit of context sort of the history of what we've been seeing. I'm going to be showing several of these graphs in a row. On the x-axis here on the bottom, you'll see time. Each one of these is a separate month starting from August 2022 going up until December 2024. On the y-axis, you see the number count. That's simply because I've charted both the number of green crab or EGC removed and the number of trap checks that occurred. When we calculate catch per unit effort here in Washington, we usually say this is how many green crabs were caught per 100 trap checks. But because there's not a really good standardization of the number of traps and how they're deployed and how frequently they're deployed. It gets really messy. So I prefer to sort of look at it this way. And so you can see how much effort was put in alongside. I'm going to see if I can actually do this. Let's see, laser pointer. I hope people can see this now. You can see changes in the number of green crab as well as changes in the effort. So like you can look at comparing the fall, that's this orange color here of 2022 to the fall of 2023, and then to the fall of 2024. And you can see that there really wasn't, in fact, efforts went down in 2023. There was less trapping. The boxes have gone lower, but the number of green crabs also has reduced, the number that were being pulled out. Those number of green crabs have gone up in 2024, despite the fact that there isn't more trapping effort. So that suggests to us that the 2024 numbers are higher than what we saw in 2023. I should mention also, again, that the main message of this overall decline in North Puget Sound was driven by the vast reduction of green crabs in Lummi Sea Pond, and that this uptick here seems to be from populations outside of the sea pond. And so there's a lot of concern about the establishment and potential growth of these new populations. But again, there's also a little bit of an explanation as to why we might have seen it that I'll get at in a minute. This is the North Coast. So this is primarily work by the Makah tribe. They are the managers of this area. It's their sovereign territory. And so they've done great work, a ton of effort, and they've really brought down green crab numbers since 2022. Doesn't seem to be a huge difference in numbers from 2023 to 2024. They've maybe done a little less trapping effort, so maybe that's suggesting the populations have gone down. But overall, they've been doing good, consistent work, bringing in green crab numbers across this time. And lastly, we have Willapa Bay. As you can see, we've got pretty consistent numbers for different periods. We've again, though, had this really high peak here in 2024 with just massive amounts of green crabs being removed. I will say that the current thought is the main reason we're seeing this is due to the El Nino Southern Oscillation events. So this last year we had an El Nino event, which tends to coincide very closely with the high recruitment events of green crab along the Pacific coast. So what's essentially happening is warmer water is being transported up north, and that helps to increase the survival and transport of green crabs from more southern populations. So we're not entirely sure if this event explains all the higher numbers of green crab we've been catching. It certainly aligns with what we've seen historically. And so we're not surprised we caught a lot more green crab this year, but until next year, we're not going to be able to really definitively say if this was simply an event triggered by this high recruitment or if it's a change in the population. So now they are bigger than they were before. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think the larger numbers are a need to 100% panic about the bigger numbers, but it is still a concern and it is still something that needs to be observed and monitored and taken into account in our future trapping efforts. The work that's being done with green crab in the state is not limited to trapping and removal efforts. I want to highlight a couple of interesting research projects from the last couple of years. One particularly interesting study was done by Fisher et al. On DNA metabarcoding of green crab gut contents. Basically, they wanted to determine what the large male green crabs were eating, and so they collected green crabs from Willapa Bay in 4 locations. Half of them were on clam beds, and half of them were additional sites where long-term monitoring took place. And they sampled 86 of those crabs and did a DNA analysis of the stomach contents to see what was in them. So a couple of interesting things. There were only one of the crabs they studied had a manila clam in its stomach. I should point out that this doesn't tell us that like only 1 in 86 crabs eat manila clams or that 1/86 of their diet is manila clams. All this can really tell us is that at least we know manila clams are eaten by some crabs sometimes in the wild. That's all we can really distinguish from this. There wasn't a detection of Pacific and Olympia oysters. They didn't sample for this, and so it's unclear whether this methodology could be used to determine whether oysters are in the gut content of the crabs. They did find that 3 green crabs had consumed Dungeness crabs, but it should be noted that that was only in traps where Dungeness crab were also present. So it's unclear whether the green crabs ate the Dungeness crabs and then got captured, or if they got captured and because they were in the same trap as a Dungeness, ate them. And so it's difficult to kind of parse this out. But it is a really good kind of starting point for us to assess and try to understand the potential impacts of green crab on these commercially important species. Another study that was done by Ben Rubinoff et al. I should mention that Ben is now a member of the aquatic invasive species division, and we're really lucky to have them as part of our team. And so they did an analysis where they looked at long-term monitoring data from Washington Sea Grant and I believe also from WDFW's efforts and looked at the correlation between green crab abundances and other prey species. And they found that the number of hairy shore crab and Dungeness crabs found in traps decreased with the number of green crabs. So more green crabs, fewer of these native crab species. They also did a trial where they tethered hairy shore crabs and deployed them throughout Willapa Bay and saw the survival rate of those tethered crabs and compared that to trap abundances of green crabs previously to get an idea of how was the survival of hairy shore crabs related to green crab abundance. This is a technique that's been used other times before and is a pretty good kind of generalization for this. And they found that green crab hairy shore crab survival declined with higher green crab abundance. So again, all this suggests that green crabs are having an impact on hairy shore crabs and possibly other species. One other quick thing I want to mention is that we are very fortunate that working with State Representative Joel McIntyre, we managed to get some funding for the sequencing and annotation of the European green crab genome. Now, it might seem like, well, haven't we done that before? But the answer is no. Crabs actually have kind of messy DNA, as one of my colleagues refers to it. My understanding is that the genome has a lot of redundancies and a lot of just sort of extra code to it. And so it's difficult to map this out, and it's only been in recent years that crab genomes could be properly annotated and mapped. And so this is something that's really a baseline activity that has to happen in order to do any sort of potential genetic work with green crab. And so the hope is that we will have this done by the end of the year, and we will be able to, once that genome is mapped, we'll be able to actually share it with the public and make it open source so anybody can do any sort of research they want with it. All right, very quickly, I'm just going to throw out there, if anybody loves this talk and anybody really wants to get their feet wet with some green crab work, one thing we always recommend everybody do is if you're out in the field and you think you see a green crab, to report it to us. So take a detailed picture of the crab. We particularly want a nice image of that carapace if at all possible. Note the location, report it to us. You can either send it to ais@dfw.wa.gov, or you can call us at the 1-888-WDFW-AIS, use the Washington Invasive Species app. But basically just get a good picture, tell us where and when, and send it to us. Again, we get a lot of crabs that aren't green crabs, but I love that because it means people are actually taking a look out there. And to be honest, if you think you see any aquatic invasive species, you're more than welcome to send us these pictures. We are really happy to help clarify what people are finding. And if you do find something we're worried about, it's really helpful and informative. Lastly, if you really do want to get out there and get your feet wet, there's a couple of options. You could join the Washington Sea Grants Crab Team. They have a monthly monitoring network that runs from April to September, and they go out there to these various locations throughout the state and do standardized monitoring. It's been going on for 10 years now, and it's a great resource for us just to have this long-term data set. If you want something a little less impactful, you can join the molt search team, which is a completely just very, very quick training online. And you walk along a length of shoreline, look for molts, and if you think you see them, report them. So real simple stuff. Now, before I go for questions, I just want to say, if you only remember one thing from all my crab talk today, is I want you to understand that green crabs are an emergency here in Washington and beyond. But it's not a lost cause or a fight that shouldn't be done. Much of Washington remains uninvaded, and even in those areas where green crabs are present, there's a lot of good that can be done through hard work. And again, if you think you find a green crab, just please be sure to report it. Again, if it's not a green crab, it's only going to make me happy that it's not one. So never hesitate to send it in. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. That was a great both introduction and kind of more details there. So thank you. There's a number of questions in the chat, but maybe we can first go to people raising their hands. So go ahead, Patrick.
Patrick, do you have a question?
There we go. I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Officer Murray over in Kitsap County. Now I know there's, other crabs that can't be, misidentified as European green crabs. And I wasn't here, unfortunately, for the entire meeting, but has there been any talk of allowing the public to harvest these crabs recreationally?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So right now, I should say the policy is we don't want people doing that, not because we don't. Basically, the main concern is accidentally killing native species. We've gotten reports of people doing things like, I've done a great job, I killed like 40 green crab, and it turns out it was just a bunch of poor little shore crabs. And so that's the main reason we don't have that particular policy right now. That being said, we never know what the future will hold. It's not something that's off the table forever. I will say that, Oregon and California both have fisheries open for green crabs, so people can go and catch them and remove them on their own. And it's not as if suddenly green crab are not a problem in California or Oregon. So if it happens, it's not something that could solve necessarily the green crab issue, but it may be beneficial. There's actually some students in Portland State right now working on a review looking at some of the history of incentive programs, particularly for green crab on the East Coast. And so we're still kind of waiting to get that all summarized. But again, it's never going to be, if it changes, it's never going to be like the end all be all solution, but it could be a tool to help maybe control numbers a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's something like you said that could help control the population. And for example, people can harvest Dungeness crabs, right, but not Pacific graceful, and those are commonly misidentified. So,
Yeah.
I think
Right.
we could open it up as long as we obviously provide the information and the different, identification between the species, because we have the same thing with salmon, king salmon and pink salmon and everything else. So I don't think we should leave it closed just because of misidentification. But I think it's something that we should look into possibly opening that would not only help with control the population, but also allow recreational opportunities for people in the state.
I will also mention that one of the complications with green crab is that they're like, you can eat them. They taste fine. I've eaten them because people kept asking me about it, but they're very small and have a very low meat to body ratio. So nobody's really going to particularly want to harvest them over, say, Dungeness or Red Rock. And the other thing is you don't catch them in the same way. So like a lot of the locations we go trapping are in mud flats and in salt marshes and things like this, which would have a lot of access and safety issues to be around. So I mean, I think it would be something along the lines of if you catch them, great, you can keep them. But a lot of the places we go to control effort trapping, it's very complicated. So again, not dismissing it as a possibility in the future, but it isn't right now seen as like a really viable option to really help. So anyway, that's just my experience.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions or things? Oh yeah, do people want me to talk about sea otters? Like it's because that's always a big thing. So yeah,
that was one of the questions on the chat.
Yeah. So if anyone wants a copy of that paper too, I'm happy to provide it to you. But it's a really interesting study. There's a place called Elkhorn Slough down in California where green crabs have been monitored for a long time. So I should say in California, there's multiple locations that have been monitored for quite a long time as part of efforts looking at the impacts in Bodega Harbor, California. The Marine Lab down there has done work on them for decades. And so Elkhorn Slough is one of these locations. It's most furthest south, but it has an established population of sea otters. I forget the exact species right now. And so they've done some assessments looking at things like people have been monitoring their diet. So like looking through binoculars, um, seeing what they're consuming, stuff like that. And they've managed to determine through estimation, the number of green crabs being consumed by otters. They also did some surveys showing where otter populations are versus green crab numbers in the area. And they basically found that the green crabs are doing a pretty solid job of keeping, or sorry, not the green crab, the otters are doing a pretty solid job of keeping green crab numbers down in those locations. Now it's really cool and interesting. I think it's a great argument for why we always want to be protecting otters. I should note though that it's not necessarily like a perfect panacea, right? Because this is a specific location with a pretty high sea otter population in a pretty enclosed location. So in this one specific spot, they are doing a good job. And there could be circumstances where we see that again, but it's not necessarily the only solution or going to be a wide scalable solution to green crab issues. I should say though that native predators always are beneficial, particularly with green crab control. We have lots of research that's shown that green crabs don't go into areas with red rock crabs or even larger Dungeness because they'll get eaten. And so there can be this small scale kind of control and movement aspect. Let's see. Oh yeah, yeah. That green crab whiskey is just not good. Like it just tastes bad. I'm looking through questions in the chat. It's whiskey with green crab in it, so it tastes about like crabby whiskey. So, but actually, that's kind of a point too for these control efforts. Right now, unless there is like a big demand for green crabs, like it's hard to figure out what you could use as an incentive for them to be removed. I saw in the chat as well, someone had mentioned, well, you're removing 1 million green crabs. That's a big concern for nutrient removal. And you're right. I know that there's some initial talk from, I believe the U.S. Forest Service, or not, sorry, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that are looking into that particular issue because we recognize that we're removing a lot of organisms from the system at the end of the day. And so this could have an impact. One of the ways we try to deal with that is through sustainable use of the crabs that we remove. Right now, we have a partnership with a organic fertilizer company, and they take our donations of the green crabs that we've removed and our fish bait, and they process it into organic fertilizer in a plant in Wilpa Bay. I'm forgetting the company names off the top of my head. But there's also local efforts like the Shoalwater Bay Indian Tribe does local composting of their crabs. And so there are more sustainable, beneficial ways to deal with the waste, but there is still that concern of what we're pulling out of the system. Is that having a larger impact? And to be honest, I'm just not sure. Let's see. Trying to do here.
Someone had a question about Japonica.
Oh, Japonica, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know, to be honest. That's a really good question. I don't know if they do anything like facilitating their presence. Just talking out of the top of my head, I would assume they would equally burrow and dig up any eelgrass species if there's bivalves in there. So it's not like they wouldn't dig out Japonica. It may be that if they dig out I can't think of the native species right this moment, but if they dig out the native species, it may create an opportunity for Japonica to establish or spread, but I think it would impact both species roughly equally.
Any more maps in other states, provinces, surrounding areas?
Yeah, so there are, I should say that I don't have these kinds of maps for other locations. The honest truth is that while there are researchers and people who care about the green crab issue in Washington not Washington, in California and Oregon, it's nowhere near the priority. Like we have dedicated staff at WDFW plus all these co-managers, tribes, and partners being involved. I don't believe there is a single person in Oregon whose full-time job is green crab management. Because it's just not the same demand. There isn't the uproar to take action that happened here in Washington, right? So there was a lot of impetus for work to happen here. It was made a priority. It's just not the case in California or Oregon. I know in BC it's a little more complicated. I don't want to tell their story without someone from there being able to fact check me on it. But I know that it's a bigger concern there than further south. again, not because the crabs aren't there. It's just if industry doesn't, we had a lot of input from industry and the tribes and lots of other groups saying this was a priority for us. And so it's become a priority. So yeah, there just isn't as much info. BC, though, does have more records and that kind of thing. Let's see. I saw something in here about bycatch. Most common bycatch we get are hairy shore crab, staghorn sculpins. We try really hard to make sure that our trapping efforts are very minimal in terms of their impact to bycatch. So we check them every 24 hours, the traps, when they're deployed. Any longer, and there's concerns of, the trap could be exposed to air for too long or something like that. We make sure that the traps are low enough in the water that we're not catching weird mammal bycatch like rodents or raccoons, but we're higher up in the water. We're higher up in the water, so we maybe don't catch as many. We try to avoid catching larger fish or anything like that, and a lot of efforts taken for these different trap designs to minimize bycatch as much as possible. If anyone else has a question, please chat it out. I'm also looking to see if I can find any more questions here in the chat.
Sounds like one more. Can larval EGC be identified in plankton toes?
They can. It's kind of tricky. Like, it requires really specific training. And I should say that our colleagues at the Padilla Bay Natural Estuary Research Reserve have done a lot of really good work. Nicole Burnett has done a workshop on larval identification of the green crab and has released a lot of literature that's publicly available on it. That being said, there hasn't been a lot of luck catching green crab larvae. Sometimes in the plankton toes, we do get they have been collected, but the light traps, even though we would expect them to be effective because green crab larvae are attracted to light, it's not the same way as, say, the Dungeness trapping network that does a lot of monitoring. I forget the exact name of it. It's the Crab Lab or something along those names. They do a lot of Dungeness monitoring, and they catch Dungeness larvae really easily in the light traps, but it just doesn't really seem to be the same for green crab larvae. We are doing some new attempts. So Carl Ostberg with USGS has been doing some eDNA analysis with the idea of being like, you could deploy a light trap and then do an eDNA testing of the water in the trap to see if there's larvae in there, as opposed to trying to physically collect and identify them, which might be, a human error kind of thing. So we're still working on it, but the short answer is yes, you can identify green crab larvae by sight. So
Cool. Okay, yeah, there's a nice link there in the chat. And so, yeah, we've got about 1 more minute. So I think just to respect all of our time, we will say thank you again to Brian and, good luck with future.
Happy hunting.
There's a lot of people who work on this throughout the agency. So thank you for your efforts and good luck with things.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I'm happy to hang out for a minute if anyone has any questions. So if you do have any questions for me off the recording, just please stick around.